Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority Breakfast webinar brought to you today by GHD. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director of 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. And our job is to keep our network of local authorities and the development community of developers, investors, and their influencers connected. In normal times, we'd be doing that through brand and place consultancy, through events, through publications. But during lockdown, we've been doing it through webinars. We've got a platform called Sitematch 365, at which councils brief developers on development opportunities, followed by focused online meetings. And this, the Voice of Authority, a platform for councils to discuss the challenges they face, the influences on their decision-making, and issues of urgency. And the issue today is high street recovery. In particular, how data analysis can inform and support recovery strategies. You might recall a session back on 2nd of June when we looked at practical steps that councils could take to help revive high streets. And one of our panellists then, the excellent Louise Wood of Cornwall Council, talked about the difficulty of knowing what to do with all the data being made available. Well, we listened to the voice of that authority, and here we are. How can detailed analytics and data insights help town centres and high streets attract customers? As high streets change the way they operate, how do we measure what's attracting people? How important is it to be responsive to needs rather than to expectations? And how will data help town centres to win customer loyalty in the long term? To answer these questions and more, we've worked with GHD to assemble a superb panel, and it's a pleasure to introduce to you in alphabetical order Nic Durston, the Chief Executive of the South Bank Employers Group, Allison Herbert, Chief Executive of Bath Business Improvement District, Ian Sandison, Chief Exec of Cambridge Business Improvement District, and Steve Scott, Executive Advisor, UK, Europe and Middle East at GHD. There are two bits of housekeeping before we hand over the breakfast table to them for the next 30 minutes or so. Firstly, viewers, let me remind you that from about 9 or so, we'll be putting your questions to the panel. So please make sure that you use the Q&A function on your screens to stimulate the conversation and inspire our panelists to share their insight and their experience. And secondly, a reminder that we're going to be loading some snap polls onto your screens during the session, and your responses to those are going to provide us with material for our report on this session. But before any of that, it's up to our panelists to stir you into action. So let's see what levels of energy and enthusiasm they can bring to breakfast. No pressure, panel. Right, we're going to start in London with the South Bank Employers Group. Nic, how significant a role has data analysis played in high street management to date? And what's data telling you about the effects of COVID-19 on the town centres? Set the scene for us.
Sure, thank you, Toby. I'm Chief Executive of South Bank Employers Group, but also Chief Executive of South Bank Business Improvement District, which the Employers Group set up 6 years ago. They're separate companies, but interlinked. Now's not the time to explain the relationship between the two, but essentially the Employers Group has been around for 30 years. So we have a very detailed, long-standing track record of shaping the South Bank as I guess a international, national, but also local centre for culture, for art, for tourism, for office community. So whilst we don't have a traditional high street as such, the South Bank still does perform, a range of functions from a sort of town centre through to an international part of the central activity zone, and obviously in the capital city. So we put a huge emphasis on data, and I guess in this introductory section, I'd make 3 key points. The first one is an obvious one, but actually I am still struck at how organisations still don't understand the difference between information, data, and insight. So the first point is be really, really clear about, what are you collecting, what are you analysing, what are you looking at? We have, I can't tell you how much information we have. We have huge amounts of data. But for me, it's all about insight. It's all about how you use data, how you drive data, how you manipulate data to give you insight that enables you then to shape and influence what it is that you want to see. Some of that is very, very kind of like consumer oriented. Some of it is very much about how you create a collective picture. So, for example, we, because of our deep commitment to a collaborative approach in working with lots of employers, lots of organisations in the South Bank. We do benefit from organisations the likes of Merlin and the South Bank Centre, who will willingly, subject to commercial confidentiality, share some of their data around visitor numbers and visitor types. You need to be pretty good to understand what Merlin are looking at in terms of their data and what the South Bank Centre are looking at in terms of footfall, in terms of audiences, in terms of members, etc. So first and foremost, understanding what you use as data and what you use as insight, and that's relates to my second point, which is that an organisation has to own it. An organisation has to invest time, energy, expertise in ensuring that the data that you're collecting can be understood, can be interrogated, can be shared, can be manipulated, and that's fundamental. So, the simple answer to the question, Toby, is that we invest heavily in data and insight as part of what we do, and that's not just in terms of what I guess is classic, footfall analysis. I'm assuming that everyone knows that South Bank is also home to Waterloo Station, Europe's largest transport interchange. So even beginning to understand what that station does in terms of output of passengers is worthy of a kind of a master's degree in terms of data science. So we invest heavily in terms of understanding what's happening. The second point I'd make is that be very, very wary about not having expertise in order to really drive data to help. We're very fortunate in that we have Ogilvy in our area. Ogilvy have one of their senior leaders, Rory Sutherland. You can probably hear him on a few Radio 4 podcasts. Behavioural scientist extraordinaire, founder of Nudgefest. He always does these fascinating talks on data and says, too much data is a major, major problem. The bigger problem is too much incompetent data scientists. So I think at the same time that you're investing and using data to drive your insight and your understanding, you've got to really ensure that the people who are interrogating that data really know what they're doing and can really draw out meaningful conclusions and meaningful insights. I think the other thing I'd say, sort of thirdly, goes back to a point I touched on, is find data sets that work for you and use them regularly. By all means, commission your own, but also steal with pride, from others. I mean, I've referenced Waterloo. We get daily passenger numbers from Network Rail. Is that helpful? Yes, it is to some extent, but it's only helpful if we're able to do something more with it. But we also commission data as and when is needed. And we are in an interesting period, I think, where commissioning data in terms of the impact of COVID is the game that we're in. So previously we've commissioned, really interesting data sets on business rates, business rate payments, business rate failures, so to speak, over a 30-year period, which helped us to begin to look at the economic resilience of the South Bank as a town centre and as a place. And so I'd really encourage anyone who's looking at data, who's looking at kind of data sets, to think about what is it that you need, what haven't you got, and therefore what can you actually get by commissioning and therefore owning the data that you then need. So hopefully that's a broad summary of how we kind of look at data, how we use it, but also how you need to be quite wary of some of the pitfalls of using data if you're not kind of experts in sort of commissioning or using it regularly.
Thanks very much, Nick. That sets the scene nicely. Alison, in Bath, does that approach resonate? Does that sort of sound like a familiar tale to you? And what's the data telling you about what's happening right now in Bath?
Hello. It does, yeah. We have invested in people to help us understand the data. So that's why we're working with Movement Insights, clue being in the name, insights, turning data into insights. And we've spent long conversations in developing our understanding of how the city works with the so what question that Nick refers to. And I would say that over the relationship that we've developed with Movement Insights, that's been the kind of recurring theme, I guess, of our conversations. But what we've done is fairly new, I think. I came to the conversation as a user with a question, which is who is coming to Bath? So we knew Bath is Bath Business Improvement District is comprised of around about 75% hospitality and retail businesses who are absolutely reliant on understanding who's coming into the city centre. So we've been giving them footfall figures for many years, and they said, yeah, that's all very well. Now we know that, you know, Saturday lunchtime is the busiest time in the city centre, but other than helping us with our staffing levels, that doesn't really tell us anything. We want to know who they are. We want to know what kind of stock would be useful. We want to know what menus they might like in our restaurants. We want to really understand what they're interested in, and how often they're coming, and who's a worker and who's a visitor and who's a resident, and so on. So we set that challenge to Movement Insights and said, you know, and a number of other companies, and said, who, you know, how do we find this out? And we've now got a product which we sort of have been developing together with them. So we've been asking the questions and they've been responding, and we've got something which is now starting to be incredibly useful in these COVID times. So we know from gathering phone data, people's home and work location, not on an individual basis, obviously, it's all aggregated in order to be GDPR compliant. And we know from looking at that home pattern, we know how often they come in, so we can start to say whether they're likely to be a worker. If they come in every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they're likely to be a worker. And we also know what their web interests are, and we know whether they're a man or a woman, and we know their age profile, and you know, those sorts of things, and that's really starting to help us. So we had a lot of hunches about who the Bath visitor was, and we've been able to use this information to test our hunches, and then you go back and revisit your city centre policies. So it's not rocket science to imagine Bath, with its reputation, would be more attractive to older people, and we know that we over-index on people aged 65 plus. Well, then that starts to be a policy question, doesn't it? Now we've got the data, we can prove that there are those numbers of people with those kind of additional needs for mobility and accessibility. We need to make sure that as a city we're providing that. So luckily that's not entirely my job, because I only work with the business community, but that's where your participants in this seminar might be interested, because actually that does start to be play into the role of the local authority to make sure that their place addresses the needs of the people who are coming there. And our economy is dependent on the visitors, so we have to get it right. And then we've layered on top of our O2 data, we've layered some information that we get from Visa. So individual shops know how much money people spend in their shop on their Visa card, but to aggregate it for a city in the way that we do is a new idea. And so we can look at where people are coming from and how much they're spending. It's quarterly, so it's not as fine-grained as we might love it to be. I'd like to know yesterday how much people spent in their restaurants, but I don't, because it would mean I could have great fun on the money markets, I imagine. But actually, what it does start to give us a picture of, I mean, there was a strange statistic that came out when we very first started looking at it, which said that the average spend in a food and beverage outlet, that doesn't mean Sainsbury's taking away your sandwich, is £13, which seems really low for a city that prides itself on fine dining and great restaurant experiences. And so that means that we could bring in, we haven't yet, because we've only started working out what the data is telling us, but it does mean there's an action there which says, do you know what, that upselling activity is something that would probably bring dividends for our food and beverage sector. So it starts to give us some citywide targets for activity, and that's where the bid can get involved. We can get involved with that kind of training activity for our businesses. So, and in terms of where we are with COVID, people are all over us asking for this information, because everybody wants to know whether to reopen, how many staff to have on, how much stock to have, and generally what they should be doing. And there's some things where we've bucked the trend slightly. In footfall terms, Bath has done better than some of the cities that we've been reading about that people are nervous about. So people not going back into London, but they are coming to Bath. And if you look at who's coming back to Bath, that starts to be more interesting, particularly around that Super Saturday, as we're calling it. It's the 55 to 64-year-olds. So I wouldn't have anticipated that those were the people who were really hungry for a night out in Bath, but they're the ones who came back in quite significant numbers. And you know, there are some not surprises in when you look at the demographic profiles of who's coming back. The over 65s aren't. Well, that's probably what we would hope. We would hope that those people are protecting themselves, but also the 18 to 24-year-olds aren't. And we spend a lot of time, I don't know if this is something that comes up for you, Ian, in Cambridge, but we spend a lot of time working with our businesses, trying to make them understand the value of the student community in Bath. And seeing that absence of 18 to 24-year-olds is actually a really good indication that of the role that they play in our economy, and how, you know, how we can make the most of them, especially
Fantastic.
The wealthy ones who come and fill their homes with really high quality branded goods when they arrive, which is also a surprise. So there's I mean, I could go on for hours and bore you all rigid, but it is really helpful for us to understand, particularly as we move into the recovery phase. So I dare say everyone's applying for the government tourism money, and we will be able to apply for the government tourism support using our data, so that the government in return is able to get a much better picture of the return on investment. I'm hoping that's going to work.
Anything but boring, Alison. That was fascinating. Thank you very much for setting the scene from Bath there. Ian, a direct question to you on the sort of demographics as lockdown starts to ease, but also if you would, any insights that you've got into the use of data pre-COVID, you know, in high street management in Cambridge.
Yeah, hi everyone. So Ian Sandison, Cambridge Bid here, just to orientate ourselves. We're about 1,200 members in our bid, and quite a large bid. We have the city centre here and also the railway station as part of our bid. So pre-COVID, we have 8 footfall counters. We use the springboard system. We collect data from 5 multi-storey car parks through the city council. We collect data from 5 park and rides. With the county council, we collect data from all 3 shopping centres and surface car parks and other information as well. And then we collate all of that into a monthly report each month, which we publish. So on our website, we've got 4 or 5 years now of data with all those data sets. So we aggregate the shopping centre data into one number, which is quite good. And then we also look at other data. And so we've got a good handle on what the city was doing. And before COVID, we were getting maybe 8 million visitors per year, so quite large numbers. And our footfall was growing quite healthily over the years as well. It's quite interesting with Allison saying, looking at the movement strategies, I think, and movement insights. We've looked at what they're doing, and it's very, very interesting stuff. And I've met that organisation. It'd be really interesting, Alison, offline, I guess, to understand how you're really using some of the data for some of the interventions you're doing as well. I guess we're quite similar to Bath in a way. We haven't got any students here now, but the university students will return in October, and our Anglia Ruskin University students will return in September. So quite a lot of our businesses are very pleased about that, in terms of they are quite an important part of the local economy. And what's happened post-COVID, so from June the 15th, we're looking at about a 10% increase in footfall week on week. So 10, 9, 8%, I would say. It's interesting how we've got 2 particular parts of Cambridge are quite food and beverage dominant. So an area called Quayside by the river and an area called Regent Street. And both of those, the footfalls are much slower than what I'll call the kind of retail areas. And so they're looking at being maybe 65% down on last year. The main city centre is about 56% down on last year. And we also have what I call a convenience utility, kind of a value part of the city, where we've got a Primark, a Poundland, a Wilko, a Superdrug, a Debenhams and stores like that. And that they are only 39% down upon last year. So that utility, convenience, residential kind of part of the city is performing better in terms of recovery of numbers of people than the traditional city centre piece, and also the food and bev area as well. And clearly with the opening of John Lewis and the opening of Primark, then we can track our footfall. That has some clear indicators. And just touch on a particular project we work on. So we have a restaurant week each year. We didn't do it this, unfortunately, it was the middle of March this year, so it didn't really work. But last year in 2019, our restaurant week, we were able to track using data which people downloading vouchers and then going into a business and redeeming that voucher. And the really insightful businesses who worked with us, they actually created a button on their till in their business, which was the Cambridge Beard Restaurant Week voucher. And therefore, when the voucher was redeemed by the consumer, they could then look at the overall basket of what that consumer spent. So they might have come into the business and redeemed a £10 voucher, but they may have spent, £50 in total, and therefore we could evidence that that £10 voucher may have led to more spend as a basket. And we then had an economic index. We thought maybe the spend was doubling. So each £10 voucher was generating an extra £10 of spend through a glass of wine or whatever. And it'll be interesting when we look at the Eat Out, Help Out campaign in August as to what metrics maybe might be collected in terms of will there be any additional spend for businesses to recover some of the margin they're giving away on food, but they might recover some of that margin on alcohol or other things which aren't covered by the scheme. So that's kind of where we are in Cambridge for now.
Great stuff, Ian. Thanks very much. So, Steve, at GHD, you've got sort of wide experience of working in towns and cities across the country and indeed elsewhere. Are these typical experiences in your experience? And are there other strategies that you're coming across in terms of use of data to date that are worth relaying to the audience?
Thanks, Toby. I guess the simple answer is that I don't think they are necessarily atypical responses to data. I think what we find is that across different jurisdictions, different places, that the attitude towards data is quite different, and the use of data across all clients. I guess what we find is that, and maybe this is a bit to what Nick was saying, that there is so much information and data out there, and it's actually, and what we find even at a business organization level is that companies are not really connecting and using that data, in the most efficient way, or extracting the most potential out of it. So, whether it's at a company level, whether it's at a city, town centre level, I think there's great opportunity, and there's a lot more to do. I think reflecting on what the others have said, I'd kind of pull out three observations, I guess, from what was said here, and also just what we've been experiencing. I think the first is that in terms of kind of where we are at the moment, the impact of COVID on high streets and city centres, I think what is very, very clear is that every place, every situation is unique. Alison touched upon the catchment within Bath and students and tourists and the importance within that area of that part of the catchment. Similar, I think with Ian, I live in Cambridge. I kind of experience it every day, and it's a completely different feel to the place at the moment because of the situation we're in. I think what we're seeing across the country is that some of the larger cities are struggling to return. Some of the smaller cities are, footfall is increasing because, maybe they were more reliant on the local catchment before, and therefore for them to return to, 100% footfalls that were seen pre-COVID is a bit easier because they've got a different catchment there. So I think it really strikes home to me from an economic perspective that everywhere is different, and therefore the importance of data at the local, at each area is very, very important, because I think the response to COVID, as we come through recovery, is going to have to be quite different. So I think that uniqueness is very, very evident. I think the second point I'd make as well is that really because of that, that we're really talking about local economic development agendas here, and quite spatially specific. So, and that's where the importance of data, I think, becomes, much more crucial as we go forward. I mean, I've been working in economic development for probably a bit too long now, and reliant on the traditional data sets, you can set a picture, you can set a strategy based on the known data that's been sitting there, etc., etc. There's parameters that we use. We've now got the ability to get much more granular with that, and Allison sort of mentioned the work of movement insights. What that gives us is the ability to really drill down and understand the dynamics much better. I think for a long time we've relied quite a lot on whether it's gut feel or historic data. We haven't really got to grips with who's coming, why are they coming, what are they doing here, how they get here, all these sort of questions that make up the complexity of visiting a city centre. And I think now with mobile data sets, the ability to combine mass data sets as well, so we're kind of getting a much more fluid and dynamic picture. Our ability to react to local economic circumstance and rebuild local economy, I think is much more enhanced. And that kind of leads me to the third point. And again, Ian, I think, alluded to this and touched upon this in terms of, Cambridge itself's got data from a lot of different places, car park sensors, footfall sensors, etc., etc. And again, from an economic development point of view and almost a city infrastructure point of view, the ability to connect those mass data sets and give that kind of total picture about how a particular area is being used, I think is absolutely critical going forward. What we're doing is realizing an asset. The town centre, city centre is an asset for the local economy. The more we understand about how that's used, I think it's to everyone's betterment and puts us in a much better place for being able to recover from what is a huge economic shock that we're going through at the moment. So this is certainly telling us that there's no one size fits all here. Data. We believe that sort of that data-driven approach is essential because every place is unique. Every place is in a different situation, if you like.
Thanks very much, Steve. So. Nic gave us the idea earlier of nicking data sets, and I'd like the panel to consider that. So at some point shortly, I'm going to come back to you all and ask you to give an example of an interesting, exciting, or particularly insightful data set that you've come across or learnt about or would like to obtain to further your aims, just so that we can start. Well, what Steve says, I absolutely take on board. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, but there are lots of different things that different places are using and doing and experiencing that might be useful in some other places. And I'd like to share some of that with our audience. So if you could get your minds working on some examples of data sets that we can share with the audience, that would be great. But while you're thinking about that, let's also look forward a bit. The second part of our conversation really sort of segues in with a question that's come in from the audience, which is around the second wave. How are you intending to use data, and what sort of data is going to be useful to inform your businesses and your employers about how they should respond to conditions as they change going forward? There's likely to be a second wave, but there's also going to be a bit of a resurgence between now and that happening. What can you share with us about how to use data to sort of inform business about whether they should stay open, whether they should close, whether they should be limiting their exposure and so on? Nic?
Well, gosh, I mean, the second wave is so fraught with sort of second guessing what that will look like. But I think if we assume that there will be, and that's a big assumption in terms of what do we mean, what do we define. I think the obvious point is being able to present a very, very clear set of data and insights as to what's happened over the past few months and weeks. I think any organisation that's responsible for managing a place, should take it on themselves to really pull that information, pull that data together to present a credible strategy. But as we saw this first time round, the economic realities will always have to be done and delivered in line with public health measures. And obviously, we're in a period where now local government has the the right to impose further lockdowns at a local level, depending on whether there is a localized or a broader outbreak. So we are sort of in new territory, and I would urge anyone, and interestingly this came up in a conversation with some fellow bids yesterday, to ensure that they know who their public health lead is, form that relationship, form that partnership, because you could suddenly find that there are impositions, restrictions imposed from a public health perspective that will look very different to the first wave. So I think that's something which locally bids, local councils, state owners, etc., need to be very aware of. We've just concluded our sort of South Bank and Waterloo COVID recovery plan. Number of priorities, number of key themes. Arguably, the most important, we haven't ranked them, but in any conversation, the most important that we all accept is being able to respond to a public health emergency around a localized outbreak. So being able to manage that and look at the impact of what that will have is critical. But unfortunately, I think the public health, as we saw nationally, imposed lockdowns will obviously put huge restrictions and difficulties, for any business that is trying to work within a legislative framework.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Steve, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think there's a number of different data sets that are important in respect to the second wave, and Nick touched upon the public health. I think for the sort of, the data sets that we're kind of talking about here, I think give you the ability to really understand, if a second wave were to come and we went through a similar sort of lockdown, whether it's localized or national, the data sets that we're gathering at the moment in terms of the impact of COVID and how different parts of the economy are starting to recover, it can then be used in an agile way for us trying to come out of that second wave, that second lockdown, if it happens. So I think that the point for me is that, the economic recovery here is not going to be linear. We are expecting a second wave. I think, we are in an economic crisis that's been really affected by or created by societal behaviours that have shifted from, one side of the dial to the other. We're now shopping online far more than we ever did. Barriers to that have been broken down. So kind of where does that leave aspects of the high street? We are now, more reluctant to enter into some, particular social situations. Everyone's behaviour has been shifted. Now, the extent to which we go back, I think, for me, is the really, really interesting thing here. And what data enables us to do is to understand how those behaviours start to reset to whatever the future may be. But it gives us the ability to be agile and to pull different strategy levers at different times. That's why I think the beauty of the new data sets like kind of mobile data. It's much more immediate. You get it quickly. It's much more granular. So we're getting a much better insight in terms of how kind of the economic behaviours have been affected, how they start recovering, and if we go into the second wave and there's another lockdown, we'll have that 3 months, 4 months, 5 months recovery of data to help us predict how we come out of any future waves that come forward. But I think we've got to be really, and this is the beauty of data for me, we're really in an age of crisis and change, whether it's COVID crisis, the economic crisis it's created, climate crisis, etc., etc. We're in quite a turmoil world right now that I think data is going to be the key to us being able to navigate it, be flexible and agile in terms of how we respond. Because I think really, COVID has shifted the demand curves completely. We haven't gone up and down the demand curve. It's shifted significantly.
Thanks, Steve. Alison, you painted a picture of some very agile use of data. How is that changing as lockdown eases, and how do you see it informing any response to a second wave and future developments?
So we're working very closely with the council and our public health leader. So I hope that as those plans begin to crystallise for local lockdown type situations, we will be able to support them with the data that we have. One of the things that Movement Insights provide us with, and actually anybody who gathers footfall could do this, is just a really neat little graph. And it's a bar chart on the bottom with the number of cases in our city, and then a footfall line that goes, it does this because it peaks on Saturdays, sorry, and a footfall line that goes over the top of it. And actually, most of us in city centre management gather footfall data. And to begin with, we were looking at whether, the number of cases had an impact on the footfall. But actually, if you turn it around the other way, what if the footfall is having an impact on the number of cases, and you look backwards and use that 2-week lag that we're encouraged to think about? And actually, if you can't see a correlation between a kind of massive spike in footfall and a massive spike in cases, then maybe shutting down your city centre isn't the correct answer. It's actually about modifying behaviours, and it starts to give you the opportunity to question kind of knee-jerk responses, I guess. Having said that, obviously, if we get a local outbreak, no one will come. It stands to reason, and we wouldn't want them to. We wouldn't want to be, we wouldn't want to be the next Bournemouth and be on the front pages of the newspapers for the wrong reasons. So there is a bit of that. I wanted to pick up. There's something in the chat about reliance on takeaways and also the online story. So one of the areas in Bath that's been the most successful coming out of COVID is the place where a number of restaurants have adapted to a takeaway model. They were already sort of street food style restaurants where you could sit in. And actually, not only during the lockdown was that one of the busiest parts of town, it's also, I think people have fallen into a pattern of going to that area of the city. And so it's building back up more quickly than other places. And I thought that was quite interesting. So actually, our takeaway food outlets have become very much more significant in terms of drawing people into the city and helping them to feel more confident as they come back and go, oh, look, not only can I get my nice Thai takeaway here, but actually someone's cleaned the benches and it does feel clean and nice, and it does feel safe, and there are stewards in place, and there is queue management in place, and all the things that will make people feel a bit more secure. There's, we've had the classic sort of road closures and so on in Bath to help people to socially distance. And if they never come back into the city, they don't see that. So I do think that fast food opportunity has been really helpful, in fact, in getting people to understand. And then the other thing is about the online data. So one of the clever things about the visa information that we get is that it helps us to understand locally whether people buy online or offline. And actually, although the headline is, between, I never know exactly, between 27 and 30% of purchases are made online. If you actually look at a local person and compare their local shopping with their spend online, it's much more in favour of online. It's a horrifying number, 70% or something of their purchases in comparison with what they spend on the local high street. So I haven't yet got the data for that quarter, for quarter two for this year to be able to say, but that will definitely be informing our strategy as a bid in terms of supporting the businesses through the next wave of COVID. So I think that message also will be much more acceptable. Those businesses who've adapted, there's that lovely story, I can't remember where it is, but that lovely story about the woman who'd never used Instagram before. She was forced to close her dress shop. And so she started using Instagram stories and just literally dressing up in her own clothes shop and making an Instagram story every day. And she sold more in May 2020 than she did in May 2019. So where people are adapting, they're seeing the results of that. And I think that information is now starting to filter through. So the last cohort of businesses in Bath who aren't adapting and using online, becoming omni-channel, as we call it, I think we'll be able to scoop those up. And that's the work that we're doing now in preparation for, we hope won't be a second wave.
Absolutely. Alison, of course, the woman using Instagram to sell her dresses isn't paying business rates in the same way that she was. And there's a major implication there for local authorities and town centre management. But can I just very quickly on a small matter, but one very close, increasingly close to my own heart, the older I get. You're talking about food being a major attractor to bringing people back into town centres and high streets. What about the provision of public loos? You've got clean benches, but are there enough loos for people to use?
Well, do you know what? In Bath, the council, so I have to say hats off to them, kept every single public loo open throughout the whole of lockdown. And I know that's unusual, but we've shouted about that. We talk about loos a lot on social media. There's only one that got vandalised in the sort of quiet period that's been locked. But public loos is a huge issue. And we've been involved in running a set of public loos that were going to be closed in sort of an emergency because they were so important to people coming into the city. And I think that bids will increasingly be involved in the conversation about public loos because, quite frankly, if you don't give somewhere for people to go, they'll go where they are. And I don't know how many other people run bids in this conversation, but I have a team of people who clear up human feces every day. And I hate the fact that I have to employ people to do that. So despite the fact that we've got loos open in Bath, it still happens. So I think it's a huge issue.
Thanks, Alison. I'll come back to you, Nic, in a second. But firstly, let's hear from Cambridge. Ian, do pick up on any of these strands, but there are other strands coming in from questions from the viewers, particularly around what the data is telling you about how people returning to the high street are using local chains against national chains. Are small independents benefiting? And of course, the now age-old question of online versus high street, and has the proportion of people spending on the high street changed in the last couple of months, and do you expect it to going forward? And any insights you've got to in the provision of public loos would be welcome.
Great, yeah. So our city council also kept most of its public loos open during the lockdown, which is quite helpful. So hats off to them as well. On the local chain, on the local trader chain, to be fair, I haven't got much data on that. And we don't really have any data specific to local commercial hubs outside of our bid area. And our shopping centre data is most of our shopping centre traders, to be fair, are more the national kind of businesses to some extent. I do sometimes get a bit challenged with this local independent traders, national chains discussion, because to be fair, most national chains are employing local people, and therefore, an amount of their of their income also goes to the local economy as well. So I think that's kind of quite important in terms of how we're looking towards a kind of second wave, picking up on that. Cambridge has been, and Steve, I think you said you live in Cambridge. Cambridge has been relatively low numbers of infections and relatively low deaths, quite frankly, and therefore we are promoting Cambridge as a kind of safe city. It's a very educated city, and therefore people are clearly being more cautious. I think our recovery in terms of footfall is below some of the other parts of the country. We're behind the east of England, as an example, in terms of footfall recovery. Looking at Ipswich or Clacton or Ely or Chelmsford, places like that. Possibly I think one of the challenges we're seeing is the shop local means shop hyper local. So my local high street, my local neighborhood, my local village, my local town, and not my city possibly. And we're certainly seeing some impact of that going forward as well. Just finally, I think we do, looking at some of the questions, is quite interesting in terms of using the high street going forward, and what will it look like? One of the things I'd like to explore, maybe not in sort of different calls, is how can we bring more what I call industry to the high street? How can we make stuff on the high street again? How can we have bring some people who are making stuff, be it not just bread or cheese, but actual products, and not just repair cafes, but how can we repurpose a shopping centre which is derelict into a factory or something like that, or an R&D centre or a lab or something like that? Because the evidence is we're converting bits of the high street into residential, which is good to have people living in some of those areas. But how can we get more people working in the city, not just in an office block, but actually doing practical stuff? Because you can't do that practical stuff at home. You have to be in a location. Therefore, that's a kind of mechanism of bringing people in to some extent.
Thanks for that, Ian. Yeah, and there is a sense of theatre to some sort of making activities as well. You can imagine the sort of some sort of theatre around making shoes and wearing shoes and buying shoes, all happening in the sort of same kind of space. Nick, you wanted to come in earlier, and we've got several kind of threads running about local versus national chains, about online versus high street, about the provision of facilities, and now also about multiple use of space and perhaps bringing some industry and some manufacturing back to the high street. Feel free to pick up on any of those strands, and I'd welcome some insights, some exciting examples of data sets and ways of using data that our viewers might enjoy.
Yeah, well, actually, I was only going to come back on the point of public toilets, because that was one of the things that we marshalled very quickly in recognising as a world-class destination, because a lot of our world-class institutions, like the National Theatre South Bank Centre, unfortunately, are still closed. What previously are publicly accessible, what would be previously publicly accessible toilets are not accessible. So putting in 12 portaloos and craning those in a few weekends ago was one of the more interesting aspects to the work that we do. But there is a point here in terms of understanding what it is that your audience is. This is one of the key points I wanted to make, is sort of to understand what your audiences value in terms of the place that you're responsible for, either as a bid or as a local authority or through a partnership. And clearly, being able to provide a level of welcoming facilities is critical. So the idea of being able to open on any level without having public toilets was a complete no-go. So we had to spend a lot of money, and there's some very interesting, COVID impacts on cleaning regimes. So the actual cost of the toilets were relatively cheap, but the cost of cleaning them was astronomical. But it has to be done. So it was one of the early priorities that we put in place. I think so. Data sets. I know that there was a question from someone in the audience about, do we use open source data or do we pay or subscribe for the network rail data, and we don't. And so the point I'd make is that if you've got a strong partnership arrangement in place, it's similar to what I mentioned about how we use data and insight from the likes of Merlin and the South Bank Centre. If you've got a willing coalition and a partnership-based approach, you will be able to get access to that data, with whatever's necessary around commercial confidentiality. I mean, I won't do a shared screen, but every day we get a very detailed data set from Network Rail in terms of passenger numbers into Waterloo. The key thing is that data set is also comparative. So it's comparative in terms of the previous week, but it's also comparative into pre-COVID levels. So just in terms of being able to track what's happening from a comparative point of view, that's really, really key. But until you ask, until you kind of know that's a data set that's available, because the railway industry will often use that information for their own purposes, but being able to approach it from a partnership-based approach is obviously fundamental. I mean, it's still data; it doesn't tell us insight. But what we then do is talk to South Western Railway to get more qualitative insight as the train operating company in terms of who's actually travelling, whether we're seeing any changes in travel behaviour. So yeah, that's a couple of insights. I mean, the final thing I wanted to very quickly say in terms of how you use a data set that is useful is how you kind of perhaps work collaboratively. So one of the big things that we do is use audience segmentation. Now, audience segmentation is something which actually is an industry recognised way of understanding who's coming to a place, what their motivations are. Someone in the post made a really interesting point about data being data, but what about emotion? What about people's emotion? What motivates them? You can combine the two. You know, an audience segmentation is a really powerful way of understanding who's coming, why they're coming, what are their emotional motivations to come, and how do you prioritize your conversation with them? How do you prioritize, you know, your response to them? So I'd urge anyone who's perhaps unfamiliar with the discipline and the professional skill of audience segmentation. The audience agency do some good work on this. There are a couple of really useful, you know, I mean, Experian, you know, do this work. But if you don't know who your audiences are, it's back to Alison's point, and you aren't able then to frame your data to be able to really understand who your audiences are, how they're behaving, you've got very little hope of being able to influence, you know, positively their behavior and how you want them to experience the place that you're responsible for.
Yeah, great stuff, Nick. Steve, audience segmentation, that's something that is in GHD's skill set?
Yeah, and I think, you know, you were asking about, you know, the most insightful data set. I mean, it's a bit populist, I guess, to kind of pull one out of the bag, because I think it's actually the combination of different data sets and putting them together that gives you that unique insight. But, you know, there's a question around digital data and kind of seeing people more than just consumers, and what do they bring more than the money to city centres. And I guess my answer would be a bit around that, in that, you know, the mobile data sets that are available now and other mass data sets, you know, really give you a huge amount of data. And picking up Nick's point about, you know, you've got to have the right analysts and scientists to be able to navigate that and use it in an insightful way is absolutely key. But, you know, these data sets do allow us to understand much more about behavior. And that includes, you know, spend, it includes movement and elements of kind of how people participate with town centres or you know, urban spaces in general. You know, you can look at the data in respect of certain dwell times, if you like. So, you know, by using mobile data, if the mobile data, you know, that individual cell or group of cells is static in one place for a period of time, then you can start thinking of segmenting the audience in terms of, well, what are they doing there? What is their kind of interaction, if you like, with the city centre? So, you know, there's a whole range of different ways in which that data can be used, but it has to be contextualised. You know, we do have to connect it. We have to connect it with a sense of place. We need to understand, you know, the area that we're dealing with. You know, because in the end, what we're looking at is data sets that are around people's behaviours and interaction with the space. We have to be able to understand that space as well, in order to start thinking about how things are going to change. And a number of the strands of the last sort of discussion for me are all sort of coalescing towards, you know, a realization that certainly life has changed in the short term, and we're trying to recover back some sort of normality, whatever that will be, but it's not going to settle where it was. And so, you know, the debate around local or national chains, the way people use high streets, town centres, the extent to which certain businesses will survive and others unfortunately will not, you know, that's going to be an ongoing dynamic, I think, for us. Data gives us the ability to be able to understand that dynamic, to respond to that dynamic, and also set up new business models. Because I think, you know, you touched upon it, Toby, in respect of business rates, talked about car parking charges. I think, as you know, if society's interaction and transaction with high streets changes, then the business model that we need to make our city centre sustainable has to change. You know, we're going to have to look at different sources of revenue into the public sector to be able to sustain and evolve our town centres going forward. So we've got to kind of move away a little bit, I think, from, well, got to connect, I guess, a lot of what we've been talking about here with okay, so what impact does that have on local authority and local authority funding? And then also bring it full circle around into kind of what does that mean for infrastructure? You know, I here in Cambridge, I kind of got good contacts with the combined authority, and talking to them about some of the things that have happened, and I see it myself. You know, a lot of the temporary measures around movement, pedestrian space being increased, so road space being taken up for people to walk, new cycle lanes, a lot of these temporary measures are put in place around the country. And I think that, the ability to which we hang on to some of those could quite radically change the way we deal with our urban centres. But, maybe who knows, it's speculating, but if we're coming into the town centres for a different reason and in different ways, the way we use our space needs to change. The sort of community facilities and provision that we provide need to change as well, and they will need to be funded. So
yeah, okay.
This is an insight into a much bigger sort of ecosystem, if you like, for me, which is really fascinating.
Good point, Steve. And Ian raised it earlier as well by talking about bringing manufacturing back into town centres. Alison, we're talking about repurposing, aren't we? And that's a question that Alan Crawford, one of the viewers, is asking as well. How are the town centres and high streets? How are our town centres and high streets going to be repurposed if online shopping continues to grow, if second wave happens and social distancing is still a big issue, if people are coming to town centres for different reasons? What's your sort of vision of Bath in 10 years' time?
Okay, so Bath has a 2,000-year history of being a visitor destination since the Romans came and found that they could bathe in the warm water. In fact, the history books suggest that it was long before that even. So I think for Bath, because it's an internationally renowned city and it's got relics of significant world value, as well as its contemporary Georgian setting and all of the other things that go with it, it's always going to be a visitor destination. And so then it kind of peels you back to actually access remains the challenge. So transport, parking, facilities, and the dominance of retail in the kind of current high street landscape. I don't know, lots of agents are saying that everywhere is over capacity. We've got too much retail space. So there is going to be a need to repurpose. But I think in a city like Bath, that's got to be set against the fact that it's always going to be a destination, I think. And there's a real tension there for a city like Bath, because actually some of our residents, it's a place that really clever people retire to. That's a massive generalisation, but there's a significant number of very well-informed and active residents associations. We've got so many residents associations in Bath that's actually there's an association of residents associations. Just to give you a flavour, and some of them are saying it's fantastic. There's no visitors. We're down by about 50 to 40%, and this is Bath. We've got it back now, and there's a real sense of kind of the barriers going up. And actually, I think it's quite unrealistic. I think people are going to want to come back to Bath, and they won't necessarily want to come back for shopping if they're doing all their shopping online, but they are going to want to come back and to have a cultural, historical, leisure experience. And I guess the challenge for local authorities in particular is getting around the planning legislation that enables you to be adaptive to that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that whole, I really liked the word, I can't remember who used it, but I really liked the idea of you needing theatre in your city centre. And actually that is not actual theatre, but it's a spectacle and something to participate in or to see at the same time as you're gathering. And that might be the theatre of standing on the canal and actually catching sight of a kingfisher, which you could do in Bath. But it's a question of how you kind of wrap that round. But Can I share a screen? Because you asked me for some fun data. And one of the things, if you come back to access, which was my first point, one of the things that we have is this great catchment maps. And it's a bit of a so what thing, obviously. People don't come from so far away as they used to. But we know where they come from, and it makes a really lovely, colourful map.
Share away, Alison. We've got just a few seconds, so grab it now.
So that tells you March. The top row is what it looked like in 2019, and the lower row is what it looks like in 2020. So it's really stark. If you go to April, the blue bits are where some people come from, green, and obviously getting hotter and hotter as you get to the middle. So our catchment has massively reduced over that period, and is starting to pick up again in June. And the other thing to notice is, though, if you look at May 2019 and June 2019, it doesn't go along the roads. It follows our catchment follows very much the train lines. And so I think that's also something that, we'll have to factor into our recovery. So Absolutely. That's all. I just thought they're great pictures, aren't they? They're so, how you act on this data is the next question. But in terms of really understanding how the city's responding and what it feels like and where people are coming from, it's been really useful, and people get very excited about these maps. So there you are.
Alison, thank you very much indeed for that. And I wanted to come straight to Nick and ask about TfL and government intervention in public transport and the problems that's going to, the problems of access to the South Bank. I wanted to come back to Ian, who had some points to come back on, and Steve to round up with some examples of use of agile data around the country. But we're out of time. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much to our panel for all your contributions. Thanks for keeping us so entertained and giving us such compelling presentations all morning, and so much food for thought. And picture now, if you will, slices of marmalade toast flying through the air as viewers across the land erupt in applause to thank you for your contributions this morning. Thank you to GHD as well for making all this possible, for sponsoring this event. So big warm round of applause for Nic Durston of the South Bank Employers Group, for Allison Herbert of the Bath bid, and for Ian Sandison of Cambridge bid, and Steve Scott of GHD. And thank you most of all, of course, to our audience, our viewers out there, our breakfast audience. We're going to have some holidays now. You may or may not be glad to hear, but we'll be back on the 6th at 11 a.m. for a discussion entitled "What is Inclusive Growth, Really?" You can book your place for that session. You can watch a recording or read the report from this and all of our previous sessions at www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. But meanwhile, from all of our panelists this morning, from me and from everyone at 3Fox, thank you very much and good morning.